All right, everyone, welcome back. This is another time travel video, so you could say it is technically a unique type of superpower, but what I'm actually going to be talking about first was something that really made me scratch my head when I saw it in a popular TV show, and I'm thinking, how exactly does that work? Because instead, or the fact that why didn't they try to exploit this? And this was actually the Goku Black arc of Dragon Ball Super. Now, people are probably going to hate me saying, well, what do you got against it? I said nothing, just the fact that I remembered a similar storyline that was happened many years ago, and they had a unique element for their time travel. And this was actually in the Danny Phantom movie, The Ultimate Enemy, in which they actually had their own little medals that allowed them to travel through time, and as soon as they took them off, they were just returned to their own time, almost as though it's like shooting up red sparks in a they said in the maze of the Triverse of Tournament. It's like it's the one thing that allows you to travel through time, and and so if you don't have it, you can't do that. And essentially, what Goku Black's actual ring was essential was what allowed them to actually travel through time. They showed the alternate time rings, but they never really said exactly which is supposed to be which leads to where. So, the fact that there were more than one, definitely shows there were some pretty serious issues. But the fact that he actually had the ring the entire time makes it seem as though that's the one thing that would have kept him, bound to whatever time. And sure, the time that Trunks, that future Trunks was from was different. It said was definitely different, but you could say is the fact that um, the the Zamas that caused all the problems came from the main timeline and then went to a branch timeline where future Trunks happened to be to get a copy to get another Zamas to deal with everything. And just the fact that maybe certain timelines cannot be, undone, as easily. But if that's the one stipulation, it's like, huh, if we just actually badly damage his hand so the ring, was crushed, maybe something would cause a weird time warp that would, definitely cause ripples, almost kind of like watching Meet the Robinsons when everything started to go awry and Wilbur was sucked up into the sky, or I said, and then you also would say kind of like the how the fact of actually seeing the world that Doris created actually reverting back with just a bunch of bubbles, you would say maybe that's what should have happened, but it didn't. So it just seemed kind of strange that they never really considered any of that. It's like, if they were safe enough in the past, they were saying, well, what exactly do we know about? It said, can the time ring be destroyed for even a brief period of time? What exactly would happen at that point? And someone would be like, oh, yeah, we could do that. And it doesn't entirely, it just wasn't there. I mean, sometimes it's just like one of those many Akira Toriyama oversights that they had. Because oddly enough, when they actually had the Fairly Odd Parents channel chasers thing, they actually the future version of Timmy also had a pretty much had a time anchor. Like it was somehow allowed them to actually travel through time and remain there. Possibly because that maybe it was just the fact that it would keep him from immediately having his mind torn apart by fixing various like memories of seeing Cosmo and Wanda and things. I mean, maybe there is some balance in between, but it was just the fact that as soon as the belt was broken, he faded back to his original time. So, and that is definitely a problem if you can time travel, just as yourself, and the fact that if you start creating too many butterflies, you never know what kind of winds will sweep you into a different timeline. Be almost about as awkward as asking the question is what would happen if Marty McFly actually faded away at the dance would have essentially, because he was never born, the loop couldn't have actually been created that allowed, Doc to maybe even create the time machine in the first place. So maybe in this case, the reason why it's so awkward for someone like fading away is the fact that they want your body to fade away before your mind, is there, so you don't remember what you did, but you felt like you had a strange dream and your head was ready to split open. So that's definitely some interesting food for thought because, you know, it always just kind of seems like, in every time travel kind of story or multiverse thing, there's always like one big, prime mainstream, and everything else branches off. So the question is, what exactly happens when the times, goes off into a tangent, like in Back to the Future Part 2. And even then, it'd be kind of hard to actually question, what eventually would happen when, Biff couldn't actually, so if there was anything else that would have happened if eventually um, things as I said didn't happen again, and so would the future would have been a little distorted, because in theory is the fact that if that Marty could have actually gone into the future with Doc, it's there in the fact that, one Marty, could have been there, said as well, could have actually very much been in Switzerland, but the idea was the fact that they were essentially taken out of time, so they don't remember anything. So almost as though they just see you as what your present version, but you're not, from an alternate universe. So who knows what that could actually do to a person? I mean, look at it, kind of what happens with Doctor Who. I mean, when he tried to basically change, history in the waters of Mars, eventually, the fact that he actually told the main lady that, your death was what inspired your granddaughter to, take the first warp drive. If he just said nothing, was like, yeah, if he, or at least made it seem as though saying the fact that, everything bad was going to happen, but you would say that you at least did, so many other wonderful things in this other timeline that would lead to essentially the granddaughter, taking the first warp drive, and essentially grandma really dies a very old late. And even then, it just seems like, they kind of had that moment where they would say, this is supposed to only be happening like this. It's like when they, seems like he knows all of history, but, even if there is, the slightest shift, he kind of is able to feel it, almost as whether or not it is a specific, um, point in time that causes a massive ripple, or just the fact that maybe history has not been fully written. Kind of like the director's cut of a movie where individual things are put in between, like the director's cut, the extended versions of The Hobbit. That would be very interesting. Or rewatching the first Terminator, there actually was the whole subplot of Sarah saying, "Hey, let's go stop Cyberdyne now," and that's why they ended up at the Tiki Motel that conveniently was right near where the Cyberdyne factory actually was. It was the fact that she thought she said by said fixing everything would everything would just resolve itself. But in theory, is that you put everything in motion. And yes, there are some definitely convoluted bits of time travel where it seems as though that the time displacement thing does allow you to come from alternate timelines. But the reason why you can't go back, with other thing is the fact that maybe there's just the wrong coordinates that could be there, although you could possibly do the reverse, tracking that Carl did. That could possibly work. So that would definitely would mess you up. So definitely would say that some of the more interesting things I would do with time travel, I would probably somehow be like a phantom that could watch events but not really interact with them. I mean, not said, especially if there were like some kind of time police that would say, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. So you never know. But I would say that maybe, if they could have something, I would say I would be a film collector, pretty much, all the master copies of, old broadcasts would be said instead of just being immediately wiped, it would be almost like somehow this, version is actually someone is very rich and actually able to say, hey, this is actually how you make film that's still very durable. You don't have to worry about it, but for a fraction of the cost. Kind of like how what they used to do with aluminum. Instead of just pounding it out individually throughout the soil, they literally, the chemists figured out how to do it and was actually able to make massive sheets. And like, because you never knew how much aluminum was actually in there. And then when you realize how common it is, people are saying like, okay, now we're going to go back to eating all the gold, eating on the gold plate. So it just would be kind of like the idea of saying like, something like George Méliès, you know, things that seem like if certain things are meant to just be within a vault, forever, it's like, hey, he said I already have it. So yes, here's the one for preservation, but here's the master cut with everything ready to go. He said, have fun. Or in theory is like actually having, the way to actually mass produce it a lot more. But other things would be kind of like a weird thing of mischief would probably be just seeing certain events that comedians talk about. Because I definitely would say that when Jeff Dunham talked about performing for a bunch of deaf people, I would love to have been right there and actually had like the proof of, saying, yeah, this actually did happen. This is what would have that thing. Or when his oldest daughter um, went and got gas for the first time, it'd be almost like someone secretly recording it and then putting it up to YouTube. It'd be almost like dumb blonde, gets gas while bitch mom watches. So, because they always mean it seems like he said like next time she made him angry, he was going to put that video up on YouTube. So, but then again, after all that weird messy divorce stuff, it'd be almost like nope, someone else beat you to it, so you're not nearly as much in the hated part. Um, Definitely some things involving me, like Bill Engvall would also be there. Kind of like when he actually dressed up as Batman and walked through the woods. I mean, what if in this case you were just the friend of the guy he happened to be there? It's like, I said, I think I know who you are underneath that mask, because I heard a rumor that, Bill Engvall lives in the next neighborhood over. It said, is that you? And he'd be like, yeah, yeah. So it's like, yes, you can see, the dumb stuff that it said that he goes through, but maybe, the blows are a little bit softened. It's like, is that okay? We had Bill Engvall right here. Definitely, it was a weird experience. So you kind of have that thing to talk because when it said like from his most recent show, him talking about being attacked by that goose, that would be pretty funny to see in real life. But maybe something like what Gabriel Iglesias went through when he actually talked about how he was pulled over by the cops and started using the theme song of the cops. That'd be pretty funny as well. He said, or maybe seeing something involving his family. It's like, yes, it definitely does exist, out there. But the idea is the fact that you either would just be the person that conveniently has the camera, so it's like, here you go, like there it said, there it is. It's proof that everything did happen as it did, and you were just the lucky person to film it. Because, you know, you really don't know how far, time will actually be there. Because it always would seem like if more than one person has a time machine, one person will say, no, you can't do this, and will try to stop you, or maybe you try to prevent something, but then realize this has to happen. Although, to be honest, I would probably would say certain creators of fads and dance moves and songs, you know, they would definitely would need to be taken out, almost as though it said they would hurt themselves, wouldn't be able to, it said, memorize anything, and then it's like you would show up like the Men in Black going, okay, neuralize. It's like you would not want certain annoying songs to be played way too much. It's like, yes, I can't use it, but it's not affecting people personally. It's just the fact that you're not giving some goobers, their 15 minutes of fame. Like maybe in this case, they would create something actually good, because you never know what else is there, because or even what's attached to that. Because I remember in 11th grade, history teacher asked, do you know who this pine company actually is? And everyone's like, no. And said, it's like, well, and said, thank you for that, but they're actually the tobacco company that owns Nabisco. So it's like you never know what everything is really attached to, where everything is kind of is. It's kind of like, and so you just really don't know how everything is going to just meet up in the end. I would probably would just say is that it's nice to basically be able to see certain parts of history, um, definitely more of the past rather than the future, because maybe the future isn't as glorious as one would think, and who knows how long humanity will last. Maybe we'll have like a Firefly moment where Earth is all used up and we have to find another planet. Or maybe in this case, yes, everything is stable, but it's not, this chrome utopia that everyone thought it would be. It's like, yes, everything is fine, but, it only just kind of looks a little bit different than whatever everything is, right now. At least with the past, you could, find out, things like who Jack the Ripper might have been, maybe something like that in the Voynich manuscript. I mean, I'm not entirely sure if that was fully, discovered, but it's like, yeah, I went talked to the guy. This is what's happening. Maybe others, maybe not so much like finding long lost treasures, but maybe if there was like, the only copy they thought was the only copy of the map, was destroyed, but it's like, oh yeah, I actually have it too. Kind of like what actually happened with the production of Toy Story 3, and the fact that there was an accidental code that deleted everything, but thankfully one employee actually took a copy of it home. So it's like, here we go. You know, maybe in this case that would be the idea. That would kind of be the helping hand that essentially would do, and that would definitely be very heroic. And maybe there are some villain things that could be there as well. Allowing certain people to rise to power, but maybe in this case, it's because they realize that if someone else rises to power, they're going to do everything in a much quicker and more violent way. Although, if you had to actually, I would actually would say one personal idea that might be able to help the world would probably be preventing the Chernobyl disaster. It seems like just that little bit of a tip, was what caused everything to happen. So if in this case, like poof, nothing did happen, and maybe for all intents and purposes, they didn't actually use as big of a reactor for the experiment. It was like a small scale. It's like, okay, they said the good news is that we avoided a massive issue. It said all over the country. Bad news is we can't use this storage space for some time. Because it definitely just seems like the fact cesium was a lot more up there. Because then it's like the idea of comparing Chernobyl to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Essentially, Nagasaki said those bombs essentially exploded over everything rather than actually causing some of that really penetrated deep within to it. It's like poof, but then it's like it doesn't cling to anything. Kind of like how sand in the desert you go from extremely hot to extremely cold because it can hold, sand can actually hold the heat, with it and basically just kind of bask in it, but it doesn't really stick to anything. It's kind of like water on something that's laminated. So, I'm sure that everyone would have like that one little moment in history that they would love to enhance. Um, would at least would like to see happen a little bit sooner. Maybe in this case, the world could be different if essentially certain films, were not just, preserved better, but maybe they were able to have a higher resolution. So it's one thing to watch, here's like a very old, news broadcast, but it's like 240p, something that you practically have to watch on an old iPad. and said no iPod just to make it look somewhat clear, and then you have to do what Wally did and maybe try to magnify it, but there's something else. So even if in this case they were only able to make it 360p, maybe instead the technology to turn it into 4K could have been a little bit quicker. So you never know. Sometimes you can just be the person that just gives the push, like a muse. Other times, if there is a way to prevent, bad things, you would have to do it at such a point that no one would even notice something that didn't happen. Like essentially, here's Apollo 13 actually completing its moon mission without any major, fault, or essentially Titanic, the Titanic didn't actually sink because it makes it seem as no, it seems like if the Titanic had not hit the iceberg, it was just an oversized ship. That was it. It was just the fact that once a disaster said is attached to something, it it solidifies in history. So that's gonna do it for right now. The next video will actually go back to a few other elements of the martial arts video I made. There are a few little things that can be thrown in there, and will be kind of a stepping stool for another video related to technology and power objects. So hope everyone has a good one, and see you later.